Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll see an artifact spotlight on the history of the Fargo-Moorhead bridges. But first, joining me now is our guest, Rudy Martinson from the North Dakota Hospitality Association. Rudy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Rudy, as we get started, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and maybe your background.
Sure, absolutely. I am originally from here in North Dakota, born in Williston in the western part of the state, grew up in Bismarck, and then made it out here east to Fargo in order to attend NDSU, and that's kind of where I landed ever since then. And the Hospitality Association is a statewide organization, so still managed to make it around to the rest of the state and see our many members and customers around the entirety of the state.
Well, there you go. You mentioned, so tell me a little bit more. What is the North Dakota Hospitality Association and what does it do?
Sure. We are the trade association that represents the restaurant, lodging, and retail beverage sectors of North Dakota's tourism industry. So the association has existed in one form or another since the mid-50s. At one time it was three separate organizations. We've now merged all into one over the last couple of decades. But again, we represent the interests of businesses that operate within that restaurant or lodging or bar and liquor store sector of the industry.
Okay. Well, we asked you here today partly and mostly to discuss the impact of COVID that's had on bars, restaurants, and hotels, along with staffing issues. Can you just kind of start us off with discussing the impact COVID has had on these industries?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to do so. It's, I don't think everyone sort of intuitively knows that the hospitality industry in particular was especially impacted by COVID, both locally here within our state and around the country. And in particular, that's at least in part because of the fact that we're one of the few industries, and the only one, or one of the very few in North Dakota anyway, that was directly impacted by executive order. And by that I mean, not every industry was told that you can't operate in the way that you traditionally have. You need to curtail your operations or restrict your hours or stop doing in-house dining, for example. So in a lot of cases, it was a very much overnight way that we had to restructure how we do business in terms of told that, on a Thursday afternoon that come Monday, you're not going to be allowed to have in-store dining anymore, for example. So now we as an industry had to figure out, on a very, very rapid basis, and this isn't just in North Dakota, it's around the country that this happened, mostly at the state level, but had to figure out, okay, so how do we continue to operate our business in a carry-out only type of environment, for example, and how do we, places that are based upon, sort of in-house dining, and who've maybe never done carry-out before, how do we restructure our business to continue to cater to our customers and maintain our ability to earn their loyalty, and manage to still do that under this new business environment. And so that led to a lot of creative thinking on the part of industry workers, owners, operators. It led to some interesting sort of supply chain issues. One of the things, and that's now become sort of standard language throughout every industry, right? Everyone has issues recruiting help or workers, workforce. Everyone has issues with their supply chain. We were sort of, in many ways, the canaries in the coal mine for that sort of leading edge of that problem. I remember at one point when the whole world had sort of gone takeout only overnight, I had an operator call me and say, Rudy, we're going to have problems sourcing enough takeout containers. And my initial reaction to that particular person was, well, here are some suppliers you can potentially call. And she said to me, no, I don't mean we in our business. I mean, we as an industry are going to have a problem sourcing takeout containers. So on the front end, it was a lot of unique challenges to overcome in that way. And then on the sort of back end, in the recovery from that initial situation, I hope that we are in, maybe it's taking a little longer than we all had hoped, but I like to think that we are in a period of recovery or return to normalcy here. But There's a lot of adapting back to the original. What does it feel like to go back to the original business model
Well,
after that?
and you're right. We hope we're moving in the right direction, and definitely has lasted longer than anybody thought it would in the initial. But in the past year or so, how many restaurants, bars do you think have closed in the state?
You know, I don't have an exact number on that. There have been, because it is, you know, every market's different, and it's kind of a moving target to hit. You know, when a restaurant closes, is it because of the pandemic, or is it because of other factors that may have been involved in the marketplace or in their internal operations or what have you? But there have been some estimates nationwide, and again, other states were closed or curtailed in their operations for longer than North Dakota was in many cases. Although any period of saying you have to completely change how you operate your business is painful. Obviously, there are places that are designed to run on 80 to 90% occupancy. They were getting 20% of their previous business when they had to go takeout only. And I want to circle back to hotels on that particular point as well. But before I do that, I've seen estimates nationwide that it could be as many as, 1 in 3 restaurants will not reopen after the COVID-19 pandemic. So in North Dakota, I think we're faring slightly better than that, but I don't have a specific number in front of me.
Yeah, well, but currently it seems like many establishments, they're having a hard time staying open with their formerly regular hours, probably due to staffing. I don't know. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, some of it is, so that has been an interesting aspect of the recovery from the whole COVID-19 situation, is that staffing has been one particularly acute problem, and that's not just in the hospitality industry. It's medical industry, any industry you talk about. I think my wife is a nurse, so I also think immediately of the nursing shortage that North Dakota has been dealing with for a long time, but has only been made more acute recently. But of course, the staffing problem is one that jumps immediately to mind. I referenced supply chain problems earlier. So it's, even when you do go into your favorite restaurant that you've been waiting to go to for the last year and a half, or maybe you've been there several times over that period of time, but you may notice that the menu is a little more curtailed in some cases than it was before. And again, we're as an industry working towards bringing that back to normalcy as well. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of folks who are having to operate on limited hours, or closing 2 days a week when they used to only be closed 1 day a week, or the 24-hour restaurant is a thing that is a lot less common than it was previous to this situation. So all of that, again, we're working very diligently and to return things to normal, but there's some catching up that needs to take place after a major impact event like we've had.
Absolutely. But you talk about the staffing shortage in a lot of industries. Of course, we're concentrating on bars, restaurants, hotels.
Sure.
What's fueling that staffing shortage, do you think?
I think there's a number of different things. And there are a number of different things, by the way, that the industry is doing in order to kind of incentivize people to come back. And I've heard everything from increasing wages to adding benefits that weren't there before to, sort of other tertiary perks that aren't necessarily your standard benefits, your paid time off, your health care, or that kind of thing, but other perks that can be offered uniquely through a hospitality perspective. So we are working to sort of change that paradigm and incentivize people to come back and work for us again. The one other thing I wanted to touch on in terms of was the hotel side of the hospitality industry, because I think that people think hospitality and they intuitively think, bars, restaurants, that kind of thing. And bars and restaurants have taken some of the focus from the public conversation about this, specifically because they were the segment of the industry that was specifically told, you have to change your operation, or you have to close, or you have to do things differently. The hotel aspect of the industry is a unique case on that, because that didn't particularly happen with the hotel industry. There was never an executive order that says hotels have to do X thing differently. what we did instead was we, as a society, sort of stopped doing all the things that drive the hotel business. And by that I mean business travel was curtailed. We stopped having concerts and sporting events, and the Canadian border was closed, and all of those things that sort of drive revenue into the hotel industry stopped happening for a long period of time. And so it wasn't so much that hotels were told you can't operate anymore. It's that everything else that brings money into that type of business was canceled.
Well, absolutely. You mentioned Canadian. Can you talk about not having Canadian visitors with the border closed, how it impacted that hospitality industry in North Dakota and sort of northwest Minnesota?
Absolutely, and that's tremendously impactful for the travel and tourism industry in North Dakota, which obviously hospitality is a key part. But excuse me, I had seen a statistic from the North Dakota Department of Tourism late last year, and it's obviously the partnership between governments, the Canadian border is beginning to reopen now, which helps to alleviate that problem. But you still have, well over a year where it was closed, and that's, hundreds of thousands of individual trips into North Dakota that just aren't happening, and it's felt across all kinds of communities. I mean, the folks in Minot talk about it, the folks in Grand Forks talk about it, even down here in Fargo. The impact is significantly felt, and we miss our Canadian travelers and hope that they get back into the habit of visiting here in North Dakota again very soon.
So what are you hearing? What's the status on the border opening up?
I talked with someone from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation last week about this, and there is it's beginning to reopen to leisure travel. There is, obviously some proof of vaccination requirements that come along with that for Canadians that enter the U.S. and particularly after they've been in the U.S. and are trying to re-enter Canada. And so, I mean, obviously, I think everyone's doing their best to accommodate the new rules in the sort of newer world that we live in, and we just hope that, again, our doors are open in the hospitality industry, and we look forward to seeing our Canadian folks come back down, and we'll do everything that we can to ensure that you have a safe and happy and productive trip down to North Dakota.
Absolutely. Does the vaccination rate in North Dakota, does it concern you at all in terms of, how it can impact businesses?
I mean, I think everyone needs to make their own personal decision for themselves and their families in terms of their unique individual medical circumstances. Again, businesses also have that consideration to take, and we've said this throughout the entire pandemic, is that within the hospitality industry, whether it's lodging, whether it's food service, whether it's beverage service, we're already an industry that spends a lot of time and energy and resources on not making people sick, right? If you're serving food, if you're serving drinks, if you're doing any of those things, already you have devoted a great deal of energy into keeping people safe and healthy, and that has only increased. That diligence has only increased throughout the pandemic. So we feel pretty good about our ability to keep our guests and customers safe and healthy.
Sort of, what's your message to a consumer who might go out for a drive at 8 p.m. and stop at their favorite drive-through or whatever, and of course it's not open?
Sure. I have a lot of empathy for that consumer. I've been that consumer. In fact, the core message is bear with us, right? We're working on it. We're working on getting back to normal, just as everyone is. And we'll get there again just as soon as we can. And if you just bear with us. And we did receive a great deal of support and loyalty, and we appreciate it from our long-term customers and even new customers that developed during the pandemic. When operations were different, when things were mostly takeout or carry-out based or delivery based. There's a lot of loyalty that went on, and a lot of places even managed to find some new customers during that time period. And so, again, appreciate that, and bear with us as we continue to try and return all of our lives to normal.
What is the traffic like in bars and restaurants? Are people coming back, dining out more? Is it slowly? And does it differ between the bigger cities and the rural areas?
Sure. I mean, obviously every individual marketplace is different. Anecdotally, and I don't have any data to back this up, but anecdotally, from what I hear is that, kind of the rural areas where it's the hometown place and the bar and restaurant are often the same business in some of those smaller towns, and it's a tight-knit community. Folks are comfortable with each other. Things seem to be returning largely to normal in those circumstances. In bigger cities, there are some folks who maintain some hesitancy about it, and I understand that. And that's, again, why we continue to provide and maintain, I think some of those delivery, the third-party food delivery services, the carry-out options or curbside to go that developed for a lot of places during the pandemic that maybe hadn't necessarily done that before. I don't think those are going away anytime in the near future. I think that we have learned a new business model. There's a new customer segment that we can cater to in that way. And for those folks that maybe are still a little hesitant or worried about going back to a dine-in environment, we understand that. We continue to be committed to providing those options, and part of that, part of the new normal might just be places, that hadn't necessarily used that as part of their business model in the past will do so going forward. So
Yeah, can you talk just a little bit about financial incentives that were available during COVID, and are they still available?
Sure. So without going into too much boring detail, there's a couple of different categories of that. There's basically federal programs that came through on that topic, and that's the major ones that you've heard of, the Paycheck Protection Plan, or PPP as people know it, EIDL, which are emergency impact disaster loans through the Small Business Administration. A lot of those were just business or small business oriented aid programs, generally speaking, and not specific to the hospitality industry. Now, the federal government did put some money into what they call the Restaurant Recovery Fund, and that was, again, specific to the restaurant industry, less related to the lodging or retail beverage side of the industry. But there was some money that came through that. And then also at the state level, there were a number of different programs that the state did enact, mostly using federal funds that came down as part of the federal CARES Act dollars, the coronavirus impact relief. And so between those, there were some low interest loan programs through the Bank of North Dakota. There were some granting programs, and then specifically there were a couple of rounds of what they called HERG, which was Hospitality Economic Resiliency Grants. So there was some funding that was dedicated specifically to the hospitality industry, out of recognition of the fact that the hospitality industry was most heavily impacted by an executive order that said you have to do business differently. So, and we are appreciative of those efforts. I mean, obviously the damage is not yet fully healed within the industry, which is why we ask our consumers to continue supporting us, our customers, our neighbors, our friends, to continue supporting us as an industry, and also the government as well, to recognize the fact that the impact of this industry is not done yet. It's still going to require some recovery time and recovery dollars.
Well, with that said, thinking out long term, how optimistic are you for the hospitality industry?
Oh, I'm very optimistic. I think that we will recover and come back potentially even stronger than we had in the past or before. The question is, how long of a timeline is it going to be? And so again, that's why we continue to seek the support of our friends and neighbors, and of our friends in the policy-making parts of the government and all of that. But yes, I think we will build back as strong or stronger than we were in the past. It's just going to take a lot of sweat equity.
Well, and you're right. Looking back, do you think the restrictions on bars and restaurants were appropriate in North Dakota? Of course, hindsight's easy, but...
Sure. Although on this particular question, hindsight's not as easy as it is in a lot of other cases. But I know that Governor Burgum has made the point, and I think he's right about it, that in terms of responses that other states took to the pandemic in that situation, I think North Dakota did its level best to be the least restrictive that it could possibly be, and we do appreciate that. I think that we're willing at the time to do whatever it took to preserve public safety, but we are appreciative of the fact that that restriction was as short as it could possibly be.
Sure. Well, we're about out of time, so if people do want more information, where can they go?
We can be reached at ND, as in North Dakota, hospitality.com, or reach out to me directly at 701-527-7692.
Rudy, thanks so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
Stay tuned for more. In this Artifact Spotlight, Mark Peel of the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County in Moorhead, Minnesota, informs us about the history behind two of the bridges that connected Fargo and Moorhead.
Hi, I'm Mark Peel. I'm the archivist for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County. And we're here in the Yumcomb Center in Moorhead, Minnesota, and this is my Artifact Spotlight. Well, today I want to talk about bridges here in Fargo-Moorhead. It always takes about 10 or 15 years to get a bridge built between Fargo and Moorhead. It always has. The same was true back in the old days. You've got two cities, two states, the federal government is involved, and people argue about who's going to build them, who's going to pay for them and maintain them. Same true in the 19th century. In 1872, the first bridge across the river, the railroad bridge, the Northern Pacific Railway, was built. And for about 10 years after that, the two cities, Fargo and Moorhead, argued about whether to build a wagon bridge on the north side of the downtowns or one on the south side of the downtowns. And finally, in 1883, they compromised. Instead of building one decent bridge, they built two lousy bridges. Tried to save money that way and didn't pay off. And I've got some artifacts out here that were remnants from the South Bridge. The South Bridge is where the Main Avenue Bridge is today between Fargo and Moorhead. The second bridge was called the North Bridge, and that ran from what's now NP Avenue in Fargo to the northeast up to where American Crystal Sugar has their downtown headquarters, just south of the Yumcomb Center where we are. And by the turn of the century, both of these bridges were really falling apart and had to get rebuilt. They weren't built for modern traffic. Eventually, they became so dangerous actually to cross that even pedestrians were blocked from crossing the bridges. The Main Avenue Bridge, where these came from, the South Bridge, was torn down in 1936. A fellow named A.W. Bowman, who was actually the president of our Historical Society back in those days, managed to get a hold of the parts from that Main Avenue Bridge and donated them to our museum in 1936. And the first artifact is this bridge plaque right here, and it says Milwaukee Bridge and Iron Works. That was the company that was in charge of building the South Bridge, the Main Avenue Bridge, and a date on it is 1883. There were two of these plaques, one on either end of the bridge, high up above the bridge. And in 1883, steamboats were still operating out of Fargo-Moorhead. The steamboats had pretty tall smokestacks, and the Army Corps of Engineers required that all of the bridges be able to turn out of the way in order to allow these steamboats to pass. 1883 was a big bridge building year. Both the North and the South Bridge were built. And both railroad bridges, the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern Railway bridges, were rebuilt in those years, 1883 and 1884. So all of them had to turn to allow a steamboat to pass. These improvements cost each of them $10,000 in 1883 dollars, and that's a lot of money today. And the way that they operated, each of the bridges was built on a round central pier. And the main structure of the bridge actually literally balanced on top of that round concrete structure. And at the very top of that structure was basically a Lazy Susan, a turntable. And there was mechanism for turning that bridge. When a steamboat wanted to cross the path of the bridge in order to get the bridge out of the way, a local policeman or a bridge tender would come out with a key, and we have one here. This one is from the Main Avenue Bridge right here. It has a socket on the far end over here. This would have a wooden bar going across the top of it, so it was kind of T-shaped. And a bridge tender or local policeman would insert this key, that bottom end of that key, down through a hole in the deck and engage this gear right here. This pinion gear right here would engage with a rack gear that ran around the very top of the bridge footing, and the bridge tender would turn this key, and that would in turn turn this pinion gear, and it would run around the rack gear. And very slowly, that bridge would turn out of its way to allow the steamboat to pass. And when they were done, they would turn it back, of course, so wagons could continue going across the bridge. When they were first built and first installed, the Moorhead Daily News reported that they were so well balanced that a small child would have no trouble turning the bridge. But I've never seen a photograph of a Fargo-Moorhead Bridge turned to allow a steamboat to pass. They were only used for just a few years. They were installed in 1883, 1884. By the spring of 1888, railroads had put the steamboats out of business. It was so much faster and so much easier to move materials and people by rail than it was by the steamboats. The steamboats couldn't compete. In the spring of 1888, they all moved to Grand Forks and they never really came back to Fargo-Moorhead. So these things were probably only used a few dozen times. And these artifacts are just a couple of the items, thousands and thousands of artifacts that we have here at the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, in some cases in our storage areas, some cases out on display. And come on down, check them out. We'd love to have you visit our museum.
Well, that's all we have this week on Prairie Pulse. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.